and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Over the past decade or so, a school of thought known as Restraint has been steadily gaining currency in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. While the idea encompasses a wide range of views and assumptions about America's role in the world, adherents of Restraint generally argue that in the wake of the Cold War, the U.S. overcommitted to its global responsibilities and stretched itself too thin, undertaking ill-conceived and costly military adventures while underwriting the security of allies in Europe and East Asia at a time when the strategic imperative of those alliances was hard to justify. The so-called restrainers have been increasingly visible lately in media outlets and on Twitter, arguing that it's long past time for the U.S. to pull back, especially militarily, and devote more resources to diplomacy and economic engagement overseas, while reallocating funding to domestic programs. In 2019, the Restrainers got an institutional home in Washington, a new think tank called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, set up with funding from a diverse array of foundations and philanthropists from across the political spectrum, including both Charles Koch and George Soros. Here at WPR, we've provided a platform in the past to some of the thinkers and writers who have played a role in developing the idea of restraint as a U.S. grand strategy. So for today's episode, we thought we would take a different approach and critically examine the policy recommendations that the restrainers are making and the assumptions that they're based on. My guest is someone who's thought deeply about this issue and someone we've wanted to have on the show for a while, so I'm delighted to welcome Thomas Wright. He's the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, where he's also a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy. He's the author of All Measures Short of War, The Contest of the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, which was published in 2017. And his second book, co-authored with Colin Kahl, is Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order, and that'll be published in August, so look out for that. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Elliot, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. I think the way we'd like to organize this, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, but just so that our listeners are aware too, throughout the conversation, I'll be kind of putting on my restraint hat and posing critical questions to you, and that way we can get into a bit of back and forth and debate that will hopefully draw out some of the differences between the different schools of thought here. First of all, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about where you come from and how you think about these issues. Based on your past writings, I think it's pretty fair to associate you with the liberal internationalist school of thought, so to speak. You see U.S. leadership as having played a mostly positive role in shaping what's often called the liberal international order. But I think you're also pretty pragmatic in recognizing that the U.S. is in relative decline and the so-called unipolar moment is over, and that there are steps the country needs to take to adapt. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think, firstly, thanks for having me on and really looking forward to talking about this. I mean, where I come from, and this, I guess, is I probably started out as sort of, when I did my PhD, my dissertation advisor was John Eikenberry, did some work on, obviously, the liberal international order, which I think he's sort of the architect of. But I guess about 12 years ago or so, I didn't quite change my mind on it, but I began to sort of look more closely at the return of balancing behavior, what's often called, the return of geopolitical competition, internationally, and what that meant for that project. And what I've been working on, I guess, for a lot of the last decade is, what does it mean to have, an international order based on sort of openness and interdependence amongst the major powers in a world that's becoming more geopolitically competitive, particularly between the United States and China, but also the United States and Russia. And so a lot of my sort of focus is on that and how democratic countries or like-minded countries can work more closely together, and what the risks of interdependence are, and what the terms and nature of the competition with China in particular is, and what that means for that sort of core international order that was created after World War II. So I don't really use the term liberal international order anymore because I think that sort of concept of a single model of international order that all powers are unevenly gravitating toward is no longer operative, really. But I do think that there is a sort of core set of interests infused by values that many, albeit not all, democratic powers sort of share, and that it's important for them to work together to pursue those interests and to make sure that norms internationally broadly reflect those. So that's probably where I come from on it.
Well, the aspect of competition with China that you mentioned is definitely something we'll get into later on. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the areas where there might be overlap or similarities between the way you approach these issues and the way other more sort of conventional foreign policy thinkers approach them, and the way people in the restraint camp might approach them as well. You were quoted in a recent article that Kathy Gilsonen did for us on the rise of restraint in Washington, and you told her that there are actually some policies that restrainers advocate that are pretty widely held and hard to argue with. The need to reduce the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East, for example, comes to mind. Are there any other areas of overlap that you would identify?
Well, I think one way to think about this is if you look at the broad sweep of American foreign policy since World War II, it's constantly ebbing and flowing, right? There were constantly deployments and retrenchments, mainly in reaction to events, right? Mainly in reaction to perceived threats at the time. The U.S. has had certain things that were constant during that time, the NATO alliance being one, and the alliances in Asia being another, broadly speaking. But a lot of other things were sort of in flux. And so today is no exception to that. There's the Biden administration is pulling out of Afghanistan. I think many people are supportive of that. Some people maybe not so much. The restrainers have been, of course, sort of in favor of that. So that's sort of an area of overlap. I think there is a broad sense amongst people who are sort of particularly, concerned about the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific theater, that the U.S. needs to be less invested in the Middle East and focus more on the Indo-Pacific. And so you could argue that wanting to decrease the U.S. footprint in the Middle East is an area of overlap. So I think there are specific sort of areas where there might be some commonality, but that should not, I think, lead us to conclude that there is broad, overlap or alignment, because of course, where both schools are coming from on this is very, very different. What the restrainers, restraint is a school really that started amongst structural realists and neo-realists in academia, and it was very prevalent, maybe dominant in international security studies in the academy, well before the Quincy Institute was founded, or well before it gained more of a foothold in Washington. That where they're coming from, and this is really questioning of that U.S. post-World War II posture, particularly sort of the alliance structure and that broad definition of the national interest. And the Middle East is maybe the area where they find least resistance in what they're arguing, because, of course, very few people are in favor of, ill-advised military interventions, particularly when they are clearly, in retrospect, sort of ill-advised. So when they're pushing on Afghanistan or other, the later stages of the mission in Afghanistan, or on Libya or in other areas, they probably find broad support. But I think there is a huge gap between what they're arguing more broadly and where Washington and, frankly, both parties and the American people are sort of much of this. So I think while we can identify some areas that there might be some overlap, I think really the differences are still pretty stark.
You mentioned alliances in Europe and East Asia, so maybe that's a good place to start. I think, based on what I understand about the overall restraint perspective, is that these alliances were constructed in order to contain the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and yet even after the Cold War, they were maintained, in some cases even expanded, as in NATO. And forward-deployed U.S. military presences were maintained in Japan and South Korea, across Europe. And this has really kept the U.S. on a permanent war footing at a time when it wasn't really necessary, and that has had ill-advised consequences.
Yeah, that is what they argue. And what they argue is really that the US should get out of these alliances. The US should leave NATO, or effectively leave NATO, maybe remain a political member, but cease sort of the military commitment, pull out of many of the alliances effectively again in the Indo-Pacific. And that, broadly speaking, they argue that that would be a positive sort of step for U.S. interest. Sometimes they say that there should be a time period of notice given. 10 years is often mentioned. The U.S. has sort of declared that it would do this in a decade's time and leave time, they say, to do it responsibly. To me, it's, that I think is the biggest, issue and problem with their position, because, of course, firstly, in terms of the problem that they're trying to solve, I'm not sure there really is a problem that they're trying to solve. I don't see, the US as being on a permanent war footing, in Europe. I don't think that Germany, France, or Britain or others are trying to drag the United States into a conflict. If anything, it's the reverse. The US has been pushing the allies frequently to get involved in military interventions and conflicts, and often they do out of solidarity, with the United States, including after 9/11, of course, in Iraq and in some other areas. And whether you agree or not with those, it's sort of interesting that it's not sort of the allies that are pulling the US in. So I find it hard to sort of, understand that the problem that they're trying to solve is going to be, and I don't think there's a particular problem either on the budgetary side, because, of course, if you bring those troops home, it would cost more unless you were to basically massively reduce the capability, which, again, some restrainers argue, but very few others would argue. So the problem they're trying to solve, I think, is unclear. I think the instability that would result from it is pretty profound. If the US was to pull out of NATO and basically pull out of the Indo-Pacific, I think you would see a far greater degree of instability in both of those regions. Now, when you put that to some of the restrainers, they will often say, well, look, that's not our problem in the US. We can sort of, come back behind sort of the two oceans, play divide and conquer or balance of power politics, manipulate this situation to our advantage. And it's really up to other countries to take on responsibility for their own security. That always seemed to me to be a huge social experiment, that will be pretty dangerous to run. And I don't have confidence in them or in anyone else to be able to manage that uncertainty and instability in a way that would sort of produce a desirable outcome. So I think you put your finger on it, Elliot, that's the meta question. I think that is behind everything, is that sort of alliance question. And I think that's the one, that's the biggest sort of point of contention. But they focus less on that than on sort of the Middle East piece for understandable reasons. I mean, the Middle East part of it is more pressing in terms of ongoing interventions. And of course, it's also more popular. But I think the larger point, which is certainly what drove the academic sort of restrainers, is the alliance part of it.
Well, let me maybe just push you on that just a little bit, because I think there are some restrainers who argue maybe not for ditching the alliances altogether, but for certainly having them take on a bit more of the burden, a bit more of the responsibility, as you just noted. And there's also this question of whether the U.S. presence in terms of maintaining these alliances in volatile parts of the world has actually been conducive to stability. I mean, you have a perennial problem in North Korea with its nuclear program, and North Korea consistently maintains that the U.S. alliance with South Korea is a major driver of its policies. It calls it the hostile policy. Many people argue that it's time for the Korean War to end, for a peace treaty to be signed after decades and decades. But the U.S. is generally the one who's opposed to that, who stands in the way of that. You had the THAAD missile deployment in South Korea a few years ago, a U.S. military system that South Korea agreed to host there, and that was quite destabilizing for the relationship with China. So, I think a few other examples you could raise, but How do you respond to the idea that maybe with the U.S. pulling back a little bit, that would actually be conducive to stability?
Well, I think if you look at the larger regional piece, particularly with Japan, I think that's sort of hard to figure out how a US withdrawal from Northeast Asia, or certainly agreeing to sort of North Korean sort of terms, which would either be sort of recognizing their nuclear program or effectively pulling sort of back beyond, Guam, so there are no US capabilities that can threaten North Korea. It's hard for me to sort of see how that advances, regional peace and stability. I mean, many analysts believe that in that scenario, Japan may acquire a deterrent, of its own. And I think certainly there will be a worry about North Korean intentions after that, whether they will be sort of satisfied and defensive, and basically, feel like they can go about their business, or if it would, empower them to be more sort of risk acceptant, and they would believe that they had a shield to, when they were engaging in blackmail or other coercive behavior, that they would be protected from reprisal. And certainly, Kim Jong Un and his predecessors' behavior would, particularly Kim Jong Un's behavior, I think, would suggest that he would, use that shield to provoke. So I think I think that there's obviously been a difference of view with this South Korean, government sometimes on some of the emphasis over the last over its term. But I think broadly speaking, the U.S. is a stabilizing element there. And I think the problem that the restrainers have, in a way, is that you have these two alliance sort of systems, one in Asia, one in Europe, that have for the most part being hugely successful, certainly in recent decades. In Europe, NATO, as we saw when Trump started to question it, it's hugely popular in the U.S. Opinion polls show that, and it has been, I think, very stabilizing in Europe. So obviously there are tensions with Russia there overall, but one could easily argue that if you didn't have NATO, you'd be more likely to see what happened in Ukraine happening in the Baltics, or elsewhere. And in Asia, while the rise of China is a huge challenge, I think that the alliance system again, has provided sort of a pretty stabilizing framework for the region. So, again, I think the point that they need to convince people of is not that they might have a different alliance management policy on occasion, or they might have a different view of how to approach North Korea. But what they are arguing for, I mean, what Barry Posen has argued for, what Stephen Wertheim has argued for, is to leave. That's the point. Like, they want to leave these alliances, whether in 10 years or whenever. They want to make a clear statement of purpose. Most of them want to dramatically reduce the defense budget, so there's no longer the capability to actually play that role, to sort of tie future administrations. And the question really is, what do we think would happen in that scenario? And when I've put that to some of them, they acknowledge the world will be a more dangerous place, but they say America will be safer, right? Because the US won't be involved. So if the rest of the world is less stable, really that's the rest of the world's problem. That's their responsibility to deal with that. Now, they may say, we don't think that will happen. We acknowledge it could happen. But really, the US role should be limited to sort of a non-kinetic, non-military role. So you will have, diplomacy, politics, sort of economics, at play. I think that just, that is, I think that does create, or would introduce dramatically new levels of uncertainty at an already uncertain time. So I think that's the source of the disagreement, between the two different camps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What about this idea of great power competition, which you alluded to when you were speaking at the top of the show? A lot of people have pushed back on this as sort of kind of a confusing framework in that it doesn't really specify why exactly there needs to be this competition with China, or what even the goal is of this competition with China. And that it risks becoming kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the United States buys into this framework, implements militaristic policies as a result, and increases the risk of war.
Yeah, I find this. I guess we could. I don't think it's a debate yet. I find it a little bit frustrating because I think both sides are sort of talking past each other. So the critics of great power competition as a concept sort of are debating a caricature of the position rather than what people are actually writing. And I guess sometimes some people who talk about great power competition, I think maybe are overly broad in how they talk and write about it. I mean, here's what I would say. To me, the return of great power competition is a simplified way of saying that in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had the general absence of balancing behavior by the major powers. So when Russia or China disagreed with the US, they generally didn't mobilize militarily to prevent something from happening. So when Russia opposed the US invasion of Iraq, it did so at the UN Security Council. When Russia opposed the US intervention in Syria or prospective US intervention in Syria, it sent troops into Syria, right? That's balancing behavior. The dramatic increase in the Chinese in China's military power, that's balancing behavior, like the type of actions they're engaging in. So I think that's what we're sort of talking about, is the fact that largely other major powers were acquiescent or tolerant of US action, either because they weren't strong enough to push back or because they didn't have the intention, and now they do, right? Question is, why do they have that? My answer, which I don't think the restrainers would really disagree with, is that the major sort of authoritarian powers concluded in the late 2000s that that liberal international order was actually existential for their regimes, right? That it would, in fact, destabilize them over time. Many liberal internationalists saw that as a positive side effect of interdependence and globalization. They thought it would bring about political change. And so Putin, Xi Jinping, and others began to push back very aggressively, especially internally, and it maybe in Russia's case, in its near abroad, against color revolutions, including against NGOs, students, and others. And we began to get worried about what they were doing because it had negative externalities toward us. And so both sides now are basically trying to make the world safe for their preferred system of government. China's trying to create a world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, Putin for his regime in Russia. We are worried about what they are doing, because it has these broader, externalities on international norms, on the use of repressive technologies and their export to other countries, on the effects of corruption, whether it's through BRI or other things. So that's really what's sort of driving this. So it's largely out of insecurity rather than it is out of a broad sort of ambition by anyone to take over the world. So I think that's that to me is sort of the nature of the competition. I think what the restrainers often miss, is that they look at sort of the US side of the equation, but I think the issue they have the biggest trouble with and are really torn on is on China, and they struggle really to explain the change in China's sort of governance system, the rise of Xi Jinping, change in its sort of behavior, both domestically and internationally, over the last decade. And they are split. Many of the academic realists, including John Mearsheimer, obviously, but maybe also others, are actually very hawkish in China, more hawkish in many ways than liberal internationalists are. They sort of have a problem with China's rise, regardless of its governance system. And then others on the other side, maybe some of the staff scholars at Quincy tend to be much more restraint oriented and wanting to sort of pull back or in favor of retrenchment. So I think it is a, it is a, I think it is a real thing, but I think I think everyone's sort of, trying to adjust to it. And I think the restraint school is sort of no exception in that. And I think it is the area that they are maybe most internally, you know, uh, unclear about.
I think you're certainly right about that. And it's probably not only a problem in the restraint school. You could probably put 4 IR scholars in a room, regardless of their orientation, and wind up with 6 opinions about what to do about China. But
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because they're sort of, because what they say is, look, we need to cooperate with China on these common challenges, right? But then the question is, what does that cooperation look like? I mean, we saw in global public health, that there was very little cooperation with China, and continues to be very little cooperation with China, for reasons we can get into if you want. But climate stuff is always the example that's thrown out, but that's actually pretty difficult, as well. And then there's the human rights piece, which certainly on the progressive side, progressive restrainers really care about. But the question is, what should you do toward, what should the policy be toward Beijing, given what's happened in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang and elsewhere? And does that merit a sort of a robust sort of non-military response, or do we need to basically, tolerate or just not respond to that because of this more pressing need for engagement and cooperation? So I think it is, and you can find very different sort of views, throughout that community. So I think it is a real, that I think the China part of it is, I think, what they're finding most difficult. What they are most comfortable with are sort of the positions on military interventions in the Middle East.
I think that's a fair point. I think it certainly does seem like when the restrainers talk about China, there tends to be this overemphasis on the actions of the U.S. seen as the main destabilizing factor in East Asia, not really a corresponding focus on the actions that China has taken, for example, in Taiwan or the South China Sea, that are destabilizing in their own rights. But perhaps I could broaden out a little bit and ask you, throughout history, the United States and other great powers, as they were rising, have kind of insisted on regional, maybe spheres of influence is not perhaps the best way to put it, but having a certain degree of influence in their immediate neighborhoods and a certain degree of core interests, to borrow a phrase that China now uses a lot, in their neighborhoods. What do you think is an acceptable level of core interests for China, and for Russia for that matter, to insist on and that the United States can live with?
Well, I think we are no longer in an imperial world, thankfully, where world leaders can sit down and basically decide the fate of other countries and trade them off over a brandy, because they think that will provide stability. That isn't the world we live in. And so, again, when I say this as, someone who grew up in Ireland, I mean, small country, I'm thankful for that's no longer the world we live in. And so I don't think it's really up to the US and China to sit down, or the US and Russia, and say, what is the acceptable sphere of influence internationally, for their, for their government, right? That, in China's case, they would say, obviously, more than anything else, it should include Taiwan. I don't think we should be, engaged in that conversation. I think that's really up to the people of Taiwan to decide their own future and to decide their own relations. But I think you're right that, historically, spheres of influence has been, an option. Of course, there were always, spheres of influence, and there are now. The question is, should there be sort of an expanded sphere of influence, and should we acquiesce in that and try to facilitate that in the hope that there would be future stability? And I don't sort of see that as really working, because for a few reasons. One, I think, as I mentioned, I think it would be hugely normatively, destabilizing and devastating, to have sort of the US behave in an imperial manner like that, where it is where it is sort of, trading away other countries for an immediate perceived foreign policy gain. Secondly, I think that we would have no guarantee that whatever those lines were will be sort of respected in the future, right? It's very possible that they will continue to expand, and we don't know where those lines will be. There's no sort of clear answer to that. So, and finally, I think that even if China in particular increases the sphere of influence over time, just through the sheer weight of its economic power and maybe through some of its coercive power, I think the only way to ensure that is not sort of, it will be always somewhat destabilizing, but the only way we can really protect against it is to push against it and to make sure that any sort of gain that occurs sort of illegitimately is sort of hard won on their part, and that it's not, that they pay a cost for that, and that it's difficult. And I don't mean sort of militarily there, but I mean, I think we should be, certainly trying to work with countries, in Southeast Asia to help them be more resilient against Chinese coercive power. I think, the US should be taking a strong position in the South China Sea to push back, and there are lots of things that can be done there. In Europe, I think it's important to work with, the government of Ukraine and elsewhere to help them sort of help themselves in, fighting against Russian corruption or other sort of active measures. If we were to sort of give up on all of that and make it sort of easier, facilitate it, I think that would that would not be sort of welcomed in China and Russia as, oh boy, these folks are being so reasonable. Now we're going to, stop because they understand where we're coming from. What it would do is empower those who say, that they're totally out of the game and we have sort of a free reign and we ought to take advantage of this moment. And again, I think that basic sort of human psychology, which we've seen at many different points before, is often sort of missing. We should be very humble about our own ability to strike sort of grand bargains that will stick and that will be regarded as legitimate. I think that is, the argument that's often leveled against either liberal internationalists or neoconservatives or others, that they're overly sort of idealistic and want to shape the world. I mean, that may be a legitimate, critique, but it's certainly a critique that can be leveled, it's certainly a critique that can be leveled against the restraint school, when it comes to completely reordering these regions along the lines of some, notion that a different sort of configuration or set of spheres of influence would be a stabilizing sort of force, not just in those regions, but in the broader great power context.
I suppose then the debate comes down to what you see as an ideal equilibrium, whether the current status quo is sort of as close as the equilibrium can come to, or whether U.S. retrenchment and some return to maybe a sort of relations between powers that prevailed a few decades ago, maybe right after the Cold War, maybe that is the sort of ideal status quo to return to. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
Look, I think you start out that the status quo is always more likely to lead, some version of the status quo is always more likely to lead to, an equilibrium, unless there's such a pressing sort of sore or problem at the heart of that sort of has to be resolved. So in the Middle East, you can certainly tell a story that there's certain conflicts that unless there's some sort of solution, you're unlikely to have an equilibrium, right? So, but like I said, that's sort of a fairly unique region. In the Indo-Pacific and Europe, I don't think that there are sort of those equivalents that need to be resolved in order to have an equilibrium. The one that China would say is Taiwan, but I think absolutely that is not, that should not, that is not, I would not agree that the status of Taiwan needs to change in order to have an equilibrium. I think it would actually probably have the opposite effect. So I think our position should basically be one of trying to protect the current equilibrium, acknowledging that there's always change. Like I said at the beginning, nothing is ever static. But the question is, do we want to proactively sort of generate a sort of a revolution in these regional orders, which, make no mistake, like effectively leaving the alliance structure in Europe and Asia would bring about, or if we will be more sort of incrementalist, And I would just say too that, I mean, it's the title of my first book as well. I mean, I do think that this is going to be a peacetime competition. I think there are real sort of differences there. I think we have to be very careful in how we manage it. We have to be responsible, in how we compete. I do think we have to avoid, provocations, even as we push back. So I think all of that is very true. But I do think that these, alliances are important, and that the U.S. If you look to these regions, I mean, this is a point that I think the restrainers often struggle on. The country partners are not looking for the U.S. to leave. Japan's not looking for the U.S. to get out. Australia's not looking. Even South Korea, under the current government is committed, to the alliance, and sees the U.S. as having a very important role.
And public opinion in those countries backs up the alliance too. It's very popular.
Yeah. So what is the reason? And the reason will be, well, we're getting dragged into conflicts again. I don't think that's true. And then you get to the financial costs, particularly in Europe, and I don't think that's true. So I think I just struggle to see, like, what is the problem that they are trying to solve? What is and how do they know that they're not going to create, sort of much bigger problems, down the road? That would be my main, concern about it. And I think also we can talk about how we think those countries should react if the US were to leave. But I think that's not the right question. The real question is, how do we think they will react? Like, what do we think the response will be in Europe? Will it be Europe comes together, collectively provides for its own security, it deepens its integration and becomes a liberal superpower? Or will it be that basically it empowers populists and nationalists, that it helps the National Front in France, it helps AfD in Germany, some of the trends we see in Eastern and Central Europe will accelerate. Countries cut their own deals with Russia and with China, and it becomes divided. I mean, analytically, I think the latter outcome is much more likely than the former outcome. But we often have this discussion just in terms of what they should do if they were, as if they will conform to that, even though we see political trends that go in the other direction even now. So I think we should be very cautious about sort of promoting sort of major revolutionary change in U.S. foreign policy and in the international order, unless we're very confident both that it's A, absolutely necessary, and B, that we have a pretty good sense of how to control it. And I don't think anyone really, has an answer to the first. I know there's no one is really in a position to execute that strategy.
I think on your question of where the problem is, it's probably something that becomes a bit more visible when you take on a narrower view of what U.S. interests are. As you mentioned before, it starts to become a problem that the U.S. has all these alliances if they're not actually serving to protect the U.S. directly, given all the natural advantages it has. And perhaps that's where the rubber meets the road.
But I don't even understand what that means. Like, how are they not, I mean, I guess even on the narrow sense, I don't fully understand, what I mean, what you sometimes hear, and Stephen Vernon makes this argument, and it's a very intellectually fair and honest argument. I mean, his point, as I understand it, I'm just going from memory, so I apologize to him if I misconstrue it, but his point is that, having this capability actually empowers American decision makers to make poor choices, and that the allies do help on the Middle East and elsewhere, but the US shouldn't be involved there. And so when the US gets that help, it's actually against America's interests, and that you need to dismantle that infrastructure, and get out of Europe and elsewhere, not because they're not helping, but precisely because you shouldn't be doing it in the first place, right? Which is at least it's an interesting argument, but as I said, I think that we can have a separate discussion about the Middle East, which I think is again unique. But I think the consequences of that move, in Europe and Asia will be, and Europe and Asia were, of course, the core of the post-World War II order, that will be, very, very damaging to what I understand is sort of U.S. interests as being.
Let me press you a little bit more on this question of sustainability, because I think the point you make about alliances and them being financially quite sustainable, whether it's U.S. troops stationed in South Korea or in NATO, that point is very well taken, that those are financially good arrangements for the U.S. But there is a lot that the U.S. does in terms of its own military, in terms of deploying carrier strike groups to the South China Sea or to the Taiwan Strait, military modernization to be able to compete with China, reorienting the Marine Corps in order to be able to fight in the Pacific rather than in the Middle East. These are tremendously costly endeavors. Is there enough capital in the United States, both financial and political, to be able to sustain this over the long term?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think you can oppose the military budgets, for sure, or support them, and that's a debate that's totally fine to have. But I think those who favor smaller budgets are hard pressed to argue that it is literally unsustainable, right? That it is literally going to bankrupt the country. I mean, nothing about those numbers really suggests that in terms of percentage of GDP or or otherwise. So I think it very much in the historical norm, which is not to say that that is a reason to have those budgets, right? I mean, you could say, and certainly some of the restrainers say, the money should be better spent in other things. It empowers policymakers to do things that they shouldn't be doing, and so we should slash the budget. That's definitely a debate we can have. But on your narrow question about whether or not it is literally financially unsustainable, I don't think, I definitely don't think it is. And I think it would be, I don't know of any sort of analysis that sort of persuasively makes that point. There is another dimension to this, though, Elliot, that's sort of important, which is what will cuts get you, right? Because, as you know, like a lot of the US defense budget is sort of fixed in terms of fixed personnel costs, or in terms of healthcare costs or other sort of issues. Then there's the more operations piece and the R&D piece, which everyone wants to try to protect and even sort of increase. And it's interesting that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, actually did one of the most interesting studies on restraint when she was at CSIS, and I think she wrote it up for Foreign Affairs. But she actually, I think, very usefully sort of identifies, exactly what the options will be and the cost that we will pay in terms of capabilities. And I would sort of recommend that as, as a good sort of starting point for the conversation. Because I think when we get to the defense budget, some people want to cut it because they think there's lots of waste with no impact. Some people want to cut it because they want to cut capabilities. But then there's a question about how much. From my point of view, I think, the bit I'm most sort of concerned about are the new technologies piece and the China piece. And I think it's important because of what China is doing and because of trends in the region. And that's one of the reasons the US needs to sort of pivot away from the Middle East, is because it's important to have sort of an effective deterrent in the Indo-Pacific, not to proactively change the status quo, but really to protect it. And I think when you look at the nature of technological change, you do get into territory where it's possible, that China could leapfrog the US in certain areas that would render redundant some of its old, assets, and that, as political scientists have sort of shown, that's the real sort of risk point. So I think that's what we're sort of looking at. It's not really an arms race. It's more sort of adjustment for, from one region to the other, and then trying to modernize, the force. So basically it can continue to do what it has traditionally done, but understanding that what is traditionally done is more problematic given some of these new technologies.
And I would note that does dovetail quite closely with how the Biden administration sees it. Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council, was quite open about the importance of technology in how the White House approaches the competition with China when he gave some remarks at Stanford last week. But maybe before we wrap up, we've been talking a lot about military and strategy aspects. I wonder if perhaps where there might be a bit more room for agreement with the Restraint School and your position is in economics, because there's been a lot of talk about whether the United States should rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump jettisoned immediately after taking office. It wasn't a very popular agreement domestically in the U.S. during the 2016 election even. But a lot of people now are saying that the U.S. has kind of lost out on the economic engagement piece, especially in the Asia Pacific region. So I wonder if you think that restoring that and getting the U.S. more involved in trade, perhaps that would both play a role in containing China strategically, but also perhaps bringing China more into the realm of being a responsible stakeholder, so to speak.
Well, I mean, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it was originally designed, didn't include China. I mean, obviously, it's open to China if it does certain things, but it's unlikely to do those. I think it's let me just take the economic piece of that first. I think the U.S. is sort of stuck between two different very important imperatives. One is to engage the region economically and to have an affirmative agenda economically for the region and the US. And the second is more domestic in nature, which is to show the American people that globalization sort of works for them, and the anxieties and concerns that they had about it, as evidenced in a number of elections recently, most notably 2016, but also arguably 2020 as well, that those are being addressed, and that, there's more of a managed globalization approach, including on trade. And the Biden administration is very much of the latter viewpoint. I think it understands the first as well, but maybe the challenge is how to reconcile those. And I think you have to do both, obviously, but we have a lot of work to do, I think, to understand how they come together, and how they work together. I would say that even if we figure that out, which hopefully, people will, China is not going to, it's very unlikely that Xi Jinping is going to fundamentally change China's sort of strategic orientation or its sort of domestic system of government at this point. And when I say domestic system of government, I don't mean the CCP writ large. I mean what's happened in China since 2011-12, and sort of the more centralization of control in one person, instead of in sort of a shared Politburo system. I mean, that I think he is pursuing for his own reasons, and they are pursuing a more sort of foreign policy. And, there probably is no going back for the foreseeable future. What we need to do, as you mentioned earlier, is to figure out what that new equilibrium is, to compete, to try to bring that about. So we get to a point maybe down the road where there's more of a détente, or more of a, peaceful sort of coexistence, and a more stable form of competition. I think that is sort of the objective that you were asking about earlier. But that is, we are going to be in for, I think, a fairly rocky sort of period. And that, I don't think there's any sort of silver bullet that will sort of change that. And I think, that is not, again, driven by the US. It's more, if you look at what China's been doing economically, I think it's pretty clear, whether it's Made in China 2025 or its attempt to decouple and to become more self-reliant, or what it's been doing through BRI or in Europe. It's fairly evident from all of that. Now, again, I think we can manage that responsibly and peacefully, and I think just there's going to be a bit more friction in that bilateral relationship, but hopefully, ultimately, there'll be more predictability and stability, as well.
All right. Well, I think that's as good a place as any to leave it. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Elliot, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Tom Wright is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, where he's also a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T, and Peter is @PETERDOERRIE. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.